Judah Production presents the opioid crisis.
Drug overdoses, most of them linked to opioids, have been the leading cause of accidental deaths in Marin County.
When I was in medical school, we were taught that opioids are less than 1% addictive when used for pain. We're learning the hard way how wrong that is.
That's why the county council has filed a lawsuit against 12 pharmaceutical manufacturers and wholesalers, alleging they misled the public about the dangers of opioid addiction through their marketing practices.
We've been doing a lot of work in trying to re-educate our physicians in safe prescribing practices.
These are the companies named in the suit, including San Francisco-based pharmaceutical distributor McKesson. Company executives did not return our request for comment. Legal analyst Steve Clark says the lawsuit sends a clear message.
What these lawsuits are seeking is both monetary compensation to the counties that have had to expend money for people that are addicted to drugs or that have been injured as a result of drug overdoses.
On Capitol Hill, Big Pharma's role in the national epidemic was at the center of a House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing yesterday, where current and former pharmaceutical executives faced questions from lawmakers.
Do the extraordinary volume of opioid shipments to pharmacies in small towns in West Virginia indicate a breakdown in the suspicious order monitoring system?
Knowing what we know today, we would have made different decisions, sir.
Officials across the country calling on the industry to be held accountable.
Hearing from the Massachusetts Attorney General, who blames the founding family of a pharmaceutical company for helping create the opioid drug crisis. The CDC says 400,000 people died from opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2017. That's about the equivalent to the population of Cleveland, Ohio. In a lawsuit, the state targets Purdue Pharma and 8 members of the Sackler family. It alleges they are personally responsible for deceptively selling OxyContin. Purdue Pharma calls the accusations a rush to vilify the drug maker. Tony DeCopel is at Suffolk County Superior Court in Boston ahead of a hearing Friday for this case. Tony, good morning.
Hey there, good morning. I'll tell you, one thing you notice reading through this lawsuit is that there is a lot that is still redacted. And lawyers for Purdue Pharma plan to argue tomorrow that it should stay that way. But the Attorney General of Massachusetts says this is already the most complete record to date of how the opioid crisis began and why members of the Sackler family itself should be held accountable.
I'll be 29 on Friday, and I didn't think I'd make it to 25, to be honest.
Jonathan Burke says his battle with addiction began 11 years ago with a dirt bike accident and a 2-month prescription of OxyContin. Just 2 weeks later, he was hooked.
The way that your brain becomes rehardwired after an addiction is just absolutely insane.
Burke later turned to illegal drugs and ended up stealing.
There wasn't no problem when it was Hebrews, black folks on that stuff, but now since they look like him, they worried about it. They were putting us in prison.
36 states now suing Purdue Pharma, accusing the company
Now
of
it's a mental
downplaying
problem.
the dangers of OxyContin. In a 2007 federal settlement, the company admitted to falsely selling the drug as less addictive than rival products. The company paid $630 million in fines. But Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey says the dishonesty continued. In her lawsuit, she names 8 members of the family that owns Purdue Pharma, alleging they micromanaged a deceptive sales campaign.
In the conclusion to the complaint, you say that the Sackler family used the power at their disposal through Purdue to, in your words, engineer an opioid crisis. It's pretty strong words.
It's pretty reprehensible conduct.
Healey alleges Sackler family members hired hundreds of workers to carry out their wishes, pushing doctors to get more patients on opioids at higher doses for longer than ever before, all while paying themselves billions of dollars.
They don't want to accept blame for this. They blame doctors. They blame prescribers. And worst of all, they blame patients.
When you say that, you mean Purdue or you mean the Sackler family, or are they one and the same?
They're one and the same.
In one alleged instance, then-President Richard Sackler devised what Healey describes as Sackler's solution to the overwhelming evidence of overdose and death, writing in a confidential email, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem." This so-called culprit suggests Sackler take a dose of his own medicine.
Well, I would personally tell him to take 2 a day. for 2 weeks and see how he ends up.
In a statement, Purdue Pharma calls the Massachusetts lawsuit a rush to vilify the drug maker, saying it distorts critical facts and cherry-picked from among tens of millions of emails and other business documents.
If Purdue thinks we're cherry-picking, I invite them to produce all of their documents and let the public judge for itself.
So you're saying they knew that this was addictive? They knew people were dying? And it was greed that drove them forward?
Of course it was greed.
Now, we should point out, we did reach out to the Sackler family and their lawyer. Three of the Sacklers declined to comment through a press representative who advertises crisis communication, and the rest never got back to us. But it's really no surprise there. This is a family that rarely publicly addresses its connection to the company that made it rich. And we'll have much more on that tomorrow.
That even the purest forms of heroin. Fentanyl is taking the opioid epidemic to a new level of urgency, especially in New Hampshire, where the monster drug kills far more people than gun violence. So what's the DEA doing to stop it from spreading? ABC senior justice correspondent Pierre Thomas reports from the front lines.
Lubbock, Texas. Covered head to toe using oxygen tanks to breathe, you would think these officers are about to come in contact with a deadly disease. But this is an alleged illegal drug lab.
Us just being here next door and just regular stuff like that, and we could have been exposed.
Inside, officers are searching for something so lethal and toxic that law enforcement can't afford to take any chances. All of this because they're about to come in contact with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid often mixed with heroin, but up to 40 times more powerful, leaving a deadly trail across the country.
This heroin overdose is one of more than 80 in just 3 days around the tri-state.
As heroin sweeps across the nation, fentanyl is making it even more dangerous. And now users are taking it in bootleg pill form, mixed with God knows what. In 2015, the number of opioid deaths surpassed 30,000, fueled in part by the surge in fentanyl overdoses, far outpacing deaths by gun-related homicides. So toxic that the DEA recently sent out a warning to police around the country with this chilling story.
Grabbed the bag and I closed it up, forcing the air out of it so I get a good seal. And when I did that, a bunch of it poofed up into the air, right in our face, and we ended up inhaling it.
I felt like my body was shutting down.
You actually felt like you were dying.
And you have to be that careful every day.
Yes.
I went to a law enforcement laboratory in New Hampshire to see how they're battling the deadly drug.
This would be an example of heroin, a lethal dose of a typical batch of heroin. And then this vial would be the typical dose of fentanyl, what would be considered. Correct.
The air quality is not it's not a level that you can breathe inside these fentanyl mills. We're forced to wear air packs and masks to breathe fresh air while we're in these mills, these fentanyl mills. Yes, oxygen tanks.
You suit up to get a sense of what the agents are going through.
So you're going to step into it? Think we fair chance?
Got it. Put this on that thing.
Deep breath.
This is not that fun, I can tell you. It's very cumbersome, labor-intensive to put on one of these suits and to try to take a dangerous material out of the crime scene. The suits are so difficult and exhausting to maneuver in, agents can only wear them for 15 minutes at a time. Fentanyl nearly killed 21-year-old Morgan Gilman, who said she was looking for a stronger high after more than a year on heroin.
I picked up a large amount of fentanyl and then did what I would normally do. And then on my drive home, I was doing about 80 on the highway when I OD'd at the wheel.
She crashed, waking up handcuffed to a hospital bed. Did that make you want to get off the drug, or did you still have a desire for it?
I was so afraid of detoxing.
Morgan lives at ground zero for the fentanyl epidemic, the tiny state of New Hampshire. It's a safe state. There are typically fewer than 20 homicides a year, but there were more than 400 overdose deaths in 2015. Around 70% of those were fentanyl related. State officials say they expect overdose deaths in 2016 to come close to 500 once all the data is in. Again, overwhelmingly fentanyl related.
I've been involved in the forensic field here in New Hampshire for 27 years, and I lived through the crack epidemics and the methamphetamine. We never had deaths associated with it like we do now.
The number 2 ranking official at the DEA says he's never seen anything like it.
If anything can be likened to a weapon of mass destruction and what it does to a community, it's fentanyl.
This synthetic opioid is cheaper and easier to produce than heroin, gold mine for the cartels.
What you're seeing is very sophisticated criminal organizations. They understand the addiction issue is present here, and they're doing everything they can to control the market.
Yet another case of Mexican cartels influencing what's happening here in stateside?
Absolutely. I mean, I think people on the West Coast and Silicon Valley are working on the new iPhone. I think the Sinaloa cartel is working on the next product they're going to market to the addiction base in the United States. And I got to tell you, across the country, they don't care who dies.
It's now being distributed throughout the country, coming not just from Mexico, but also China, spread to secret locations, warehouses, apartment complexes, and homes. Drug dealers sometimes using something as simple as a blender to mix it. It's like Russian roulette when it hits the streets. If too much fentanyl gets mixed in, people die. Authorities are now trying to target the sellers, believed to be the merchants of death.
So we're going to breach at the same time. Whoever sees them first, just to be cognizant.
5 a.m. The DEA has teamed up with local police to take down a suspected dealer.
That's the dealer with his hands up.
The suspect is apprehended. Next, agents search his house.
So the search is still underway, but they've already found what they believe is some product?
It is. So this is what was located inside of the residence. What we have here is just a finger of suspected fentanyl with maybe some heroin, but definitely fentanyl with some crack. And this is a broken up finger, you can tell.
Later that day, 2 more arrests.
Is that the guy? Yeah.
Both accused of selling a heroin fentanyl combo that killed its users.
So there's 2 people in the span of an hour, less than a couple miles apart.
Across the country, the arrests are just one weapon in the war on drugs.
How much heroin did you use?
Some police have started releasing photos of addicted parents passing out in their cars, their toddlers strapped in their car seats, hoping to shame them.
The women unable to move or speak in an apparent heroin overdose.
But in Manchester, some measures also include compassionate, non-punitive approaches. There, firehouses have become places of refuge for users coming in off the streets.
We have a guy walking over right now. Hey, how you doing? You made it through the night.
Every day, a steady stream of people who often use fentanyl and heroin come here looking for an emergency lifeline.
What are we doing?
Help someone Serenity, please. For what exactly? Drug use, spice, heroin, crack, and marijuana.
This man gets his vitals checked, and then is evaluated for a recovery program he hopes will break his pattern of drug abuse.
We have a second one walked in, so.
It's a so-called safe station where there's no risk of arrest.
Police are working extremely hard to, take the drugs off the streets, and they're hitting it hard this way. We're trying to get people in recovery. We're hitting it hard this way. We got to hit this problem from so many different angles.
All hands on deck for a state under siege. Its victims many.
You can't say no, even though it can kill you, and it has nearly killed you. I mean, you can't stop.
Natasha Simmons had used heroin for years, but had never even heard of fentanyl until she ended up in the hospital, the first of 3 overdoses.
I feel like I'm finally ready now. I don't know why it took so long, and it hurts, and it hurt a lot of people around me.
It cost you a lot.
It did. It's taken almost everything from me. I've lost everything in my life besides my life at this point, and I don't want anybody else or anybody else's family, for that matter, to go through that.
When did you last OD? How long ago was that?
6 days ago.
6 days ago. Wow.
I've been clean for 6 days.
So you're fresh to this process.
Yeah. Scary. What brought you to this point?
Heroin addiction.
It's a struggle Natasha hopes to overcome. Now 90 days clean thanks to the help of others like Morgan, who's been sober for 7 months.
How do you spell your last name, Tosh?
And is working not just to save her own life, but others.
Do you feel like you have a future now?
I do. I have a job helping people who are just like me. Everybody cares about each other so much. Like, I get to sing at a recovery rally on Saturday.
You feel lucky to have survived.
Yeah. I'm grateful every single day.
Is the epicenter of that crisis.
We're on a pace to have 800 people die this year due to overdose in our county.
What's the percentage of the bodies that are in here right now that are overdose deaths from heroin or fentanyl?
We are averaging 60 to 70% of our cases now are overdoses.
Do you know anybody that's died?
Yes. My boyfriend and my mom just died in January.
You went through withdrawal right now?
Yep, pretty much so.
Here we go.
Short answer is if you breathe it in, you can smell it.
You said you have a nickname for this street.
Morgue Avenue.
Morgue Avenue.
It's not Morgan Honey, it's Morgue. You literally just walked in to cash a check, and by the time you came back, your brother had gone and come back and got in an accident and then told the paramedic that he was on fentanyl.
Yeah.
What's it like to go through this?
Hell. Every day is hell.
Goes into landfills across the country than any other single source of waste. The more food we throw away, the bigger the problem becomes.
You put food in a landfill, it creates methane gas, which is massively more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of climate change and greenhouse gases.
But more people are realizing all that food waste could be a valuable resource.
I mean, every farmer I work with is just so generous, and they would rather have their food feed people than even feed the chickens or compost it.
If we can just pull that stuff from our industrial sites and our grocery stores and also our school cafeterias, and we can pull that out of the landfill.
They're writing a recipe for change, so the food that's being thrown out doesn't all go to waste.
People are getting on board. People are wanting to know where their food comes from. And at the same point, they're saying, okay, where does it go?
Throwing more food away. The amount of food Americans waste has been rising for decades, and that has serious environmental and economic consequences. We begin our food waste story at the end of the line, the landfill. You put it on the curb, it goes away, never to be seen again. Of course, it all goes somewhere. The good thing, it's taken away and you don't have to think about it or smell it again. The bad thing, if you don't have to think about it, you probably don't. But once you start digging into it, you find out what you throw away and where it goes does make a difference. There are those who do have your garbage on their minds. Jack Chappelle is one of them. He sorts garbage. States and cities hire Chappelle's consulting company to look through their trash and tell them what it's made of.
You want to know how long the landfill can last, what materials you can get out of it, what materials you can take out of the waste stream that makes the landfill last even longer.
Chappelle finds that a lot of what we throw away doesn't have to be. It could be recycled. Nationwide, more than 8 million tons of glass goes in the landfill, 24 million tons of cardboard and paper.
We still find an awful lot of bank statements and checks that people tear up, tin cans.
Then there's food.
In the country, you get more peelings, you get more vegetables. When you're in the city, you get a lot more fast food containers with half-eaten food in them, a lot more pizza boxes.
The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that nationally, about 20% of what goes into the landfill each year is food. Add all the food together from LA to New York, and America throws away nearly 35 million tons each year. 35 million tons. That's almost 100 Empire State Buildings made of food. Enough food goes uneaten in the United States in one day to feed the Denver metro area for 10 weeks. More than 2 million people could eat from New Year's to St. Patrick's Day.
We just have so much abundance of food that we don't realize the value of it.
Dan Nicky from the Iowa Waste Reduction Center works with businesses to cut back on what they throw away, including food. Nicky says waste happens at every level of the food chain.
You have food that is in warehouses that expires and they throw it away. Maybe they made a mistake and it doesn't have quite the flavoring they want. They don't want to sell it, so they throw it away. I think it's part of the culture today that compared to when our parents grew up, that, now we don't look as food necessarily as a resource. We just look as a given.
From farmers to consumers, fruits and vegetables make up a third of the food loss in the U.S. Dairy products cover another 20% of what goes uneaten. When you look at the amount of food going unused, the costs add up, environmentally and financially. First, let's look at the money.
40% of all the food in this country never makes it to the table, at a cost of $165 billion.
And that's just in the U.S. Globally, food losses add up to $750 billion. Behind those dollar signs is a significant environmental threat when food is buried in a landfill.
You're going to have generation of methane gas. Methane gas is a greenhouse gas, which is a contributor to global warming.
As a greenhouse gas, methane is 20 to 25 times stronger than just carbon dioxide. One thing landfills are able to do is capture the methane before it escapes into the atmosphere. It's happening at hundreds of landfills across the country. The landfill in Lincoln, Nebraska started collecting methane gas in 2013 and sending it here to a generating station where the gas is now burned to make energy.
That pipe comes from the landfill. The landfill is located about 1.5 miles west of us. So after the gas gets processed and cleaned, then we compress it, we send it through the pipeline underground into the building and then into the engine. The average Nebraska home uses 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. And so in an hour, we can supply enough energy to run 3,200 typical Nebraska homes.
3,200 homes powered by gas from food and other organic waste. For Dan Nickey, that kind of system may be a good backup for food that's already underground, but it's not the solution to the problem, because food is still taking up valuable landfill space. And he says there are better things to do with the food we don't eat.
We need to stop thinking of it as a waste, okay? Even though it's maybe not used for its intended purpose, it's still not a waste because it still has value. It's only a waste if we put it in a landfill.
And that's the last place he says it should go. Why does so much food go to waste? One reason might be that it's so affordable, it's considered disposable. Americans spend about 10% of their disposable income on food, a small percentage compared to other countries. But it's not that way for everyone. 49 million Americans sometimes have trouble putting food on the table. Much of what's currently being wasted could be used to feed families. Randy Mason introduces us to some people hungry to help make that happen.
You can just spread out all the way to the end, and people can, have their own little patch.
On a mild Saturday morning in June, a team of volunteers arrives at this small farm in Kansas City, Kansas, ready to glean. That is, gather the unharvested lettuce and other crops that might otherwise never be picked and waste away in the fields.
And if you fill your bags to the top, but you can tie it shut, that'll be 3 pounds. So this is like 3 pounds right here.
Another day, it could be a cornfield near Baldwin City.
Gleaning is biblical, thousands of years old, so we're getting back to some of the basics. Wow. Well, yeah.
Or maybe a patch of beets and greens in Platte City, Missouri.
When we're gleaning, they'll say, okay, you can have this row here, and we take everything. And it's after they're done selling that crop. So it could be the mustard is close to bolting, or it has bolted. I mean, every farmer I work with is just so generous, and they would rather have their food feed people than even feed the chickens or compost it.
We started with the nonprofit called the Society of St. Andrew. I actually opened that office in 2008, and over the next 6 years, we salvaged more than 15 million pounds of food to feed people. 15 million pounds.
Though Owsley might on occasion secure a donation of potatoes or some other crop by the semi-load, the bulk of what they collect still comes the old-fashioned way, one fruit or vegetable at a time. Food that's been left behind, largely because of aesthetics.
We've been to farms where they have squash, they're this big, but that's too big to go on the grocery store shelf, so you go and pick everything that's ugly or blemished, or still great edible food.
I don't care what it is, whether it's a strawberry or a beet or a piece of mustard right out of the ground. It's so good.
And nutritionally good for the most food insecure portion of our population as well.
When people do food drives, they're getting cans and boxes and not fresh produce. And, everybody loves fresh produce. And to me, that just completes the whole fun cycle of this.
Even crops that make it out of the field don't all make it to consumers. Farmers markets like this one on the square in Fayetteville, Arkansas, showcase lots of great locally grown produce. But by Saturday night, much of what hasn't been sold may well be tossed out. A troubling thought when you consider 1 in 6 Americans may be underfed. Don Bennett's Tricycle Farms is one of several grassroots groups in Fayetteville determined to take an active role in dumpster diversion.
We do our part in our neighborhood and distribute close to about 300 to 400 pounds of food each Sunday.
And at the University of Arkansas, another aspect of food waste is being addressed. Leftovers from restaurants and cafeterias. It is, in a sense, another kind of gleaning program. 5 days a week, a student group called Razorback Recovery is saving salads, sandwiches, and baked goods from dining halls, retail sites, and events on campus, and taking them to Fayetteville food pantries.
You know, the food's already there. It's already, made to the right standards and kept at the appropriate temperature. And so instead of it being pitched into the dumpster, they just put it in our fridge, and we take it out to the agencies who need it.
The school's food service provider had some serious concerns about liability. What if their leftovers were mishandled and someone became ill? Nicole Savita, a faculty member at the university's food law program, says that is a common concern, but one that was largely laid to rest by a federal law passed in 1996.
The Bill Emerson Act does a very good job of balancing food safety interests and food recovery interests.
In a nutshell, the Emerson Act exempts those who donate apparently wholesome food in good faith from being sued as long as the food goes to a qualified nonprofit that feeds the hungry. Years after the law was passed, many are still unaware it exists. That led Savita to create a food recovery guide.
As soon as we published it, my phone started ringing on a regular basis with inquiries from people all over the country who wanted to promote food recovery, and were glad to have a tool that they could use to go to a business and say, I know you're afraid of this, I know you think you're going to get sued, but here's how we do it in a way that protects you.
Which leads to the kind of place where most of us get most of our food. The kind of place where 40% of what starts out fresh ends up getting thrown out, though much of it is still edible. Grocery chains across the country are looking at ways to knock that number down. A pilot program at this Harp store in Fayetteville began setting aside and sharing food that can no longer be sold, but can still be eaten.
Takes just as much time as it would to actually put it in there and go dump it as it would go through the table. Same amount of time. One's actually helping somebody, one's not.
Our goal is to be proactive and see if we can shrink that 40%, one store at a time, and then once we get our systems together, be able to scale it up in a way that truly makes an impact.
Dominated the talks. Mike Hanna has more from Washington, D.C.
The President and First Lady at hand to welcome the Turkish leader. This the first face-to-face talks following weeks of strained relations between the two countries. President Trump was quick to set a friendly tone.
We have a great relationship, both personally and with the great country of Turkey, and we look forward to moving that forward and making it an even bigger and better relationship. Thank you.
It's a friendship that dates back 7 years to the opening of the Trump Towers in Istanbul, buttressed by a warm relationship between their sons-in-laws. One is Turkey's finance minister, the other President Trump's close advisor, Jared Kushner. It's a relationship that concerned many in Congress, the concern further fueled by President Trump's opposition to a bipartisan sanctions bill passed in the House and being discussed in the Senate. The bill was in response to Turkey's military operation in Syria, following President Trump's surprise decision to withdraw U.S. troops from the region. Congress has been angered too by the U.S. president's apparent reluctance to impose sanctions on Turkey, following its decision to buy a Russian weapons system. The S-400 missiles are already being deployed in the face of protest by all of Turkey's NATO allies, including the U.S. Just outside the White House, a small group of protesters expressing their opposition to the Turkish president. While the protesters chanted outside, President Trump took the unusual step of inviting a small group of Republican senators to join the discussions. This an apparent attempt to persuade them to end their plans of new sanctions against Turkey.
Questions, Lindsay, you want to start off? Do you have any questions? You know the president.
One senator at least agreed to look for the silver lining in the relationship with Turkey.
The purpose of this meeting is to have an American civics lesson for our friends in Turkey. And there's a pony in there somewhere if we can find it.
And the hope expressed by President Erdogan that the relationship with the US Congress will improve.
As Turkey, we are ready and committed to sustain a very constructive dialogue with the United States Congress, and this is an idea that I've shared with President Trump as well.
From President Trump, effusive praise and the hope expressed of further arms sales.
We have a lot of trade with Turkey, but it could be many times larger, and Turkey would like to see that, and it would also be good for the United States. So we intend to bring it up to about $100 billion. That would be 4 times what it is right now.
For President Erdogan, it was a successful meeting, not only with the US leader, but also with some members of the Senate who had opposed him so fiercely in the past. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
The US has formally recognized Bolivia's new interim leader, Janine Áñez, but there's been widespread opposition to her appointment. Violence broke out during her first full day in office. 2 people were killed. Mariana Sanchez has more now from La Paz.
Protesters clashed with police and the army on the streets of Bolivia. Live rounds were shot. Tear gas didn't dispel angry Bolivians who demanded interim President Janine Áñez to resign. On her first day in office, she's facing a country in turmoil. Social and political disputes are battled all around, including the National Assembly. On Wednesday, some of Evo Morales' mass party members tried entering Congress. Adriana Salvatierra had resigned from the Senate's presidency. She tried to come back, but police blocked the way.
This government is trying to portray the coup d'etat as a natural thing. We're legislators and we need to go to the assembly.
On the other side of the barricade, Morales' foes shouted fraud at adversaries, a reminder of what sparked the political crisis that forced President Evo Morales to resign. The interim president is relying on security forces to restore law and order. She appointed military commanders before the cabinet.
Taking up command of the armed forces at a crucial time for the state to bring this stage to an end and for new elections.
The interim president has said that she wants to bring peace back to the streets of the country, and that means that police will continue their patrols with the army. Stability, naming a new electoral court and calling on new elections in December is the priority of the transitional government. But analysts say nothing can be done without negotiating with Morales' supporters.
The president must begin a dialogue because the MAS party is a reality, whether people like it or not. Otherwise, if there's no dialogue, we're lost.
From his refuge in Mexico, former President Morales pledged to return.
If my people ask for it, we're ready to go back to pacify the country, but national dialogue is important. Otherwise, it will be difficult to stop this confrontation.
In the capital, some roadblocks were removed and stores opened after weeks of near shutdown, but just for a short time. Thousands of angry Bolivians were back on the streets early, a reminder of just how far Bolivia is from coming out of the crisis. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, La Paz, Bolivia.
The UN Special Representative for Iraq is meeting political leaders to try to bridge the gap between protesters and the government. Parliament is discussing constitutional reforms aimed at satisfying demonstrators' demands. Thousands of people have been protesting against corruption and a lack of basic services. At least 319 people have been killed since the unrest began last month. And protesters in Iraq are being lent a helping hand by the elderly who sympathize with their cause. Mohammed Jamjoom has more on that from Baghdad.
As Salwan washes, she also wishes for a brighter future and for a better present. At 70 years old, her kidneys give her trouble, but her spirit remains strong. Salwan tells me she volunteers out here for over 15 hours every day, cleaning the clothes of protesters camped out in Baghdad's Tahrir Square.
We do this for free. It's all free. Even the detergent is from us. If people bring us money, we won't accept it. If they give us detergent, though, we'll take it, that's fine.
In a nearby garden sit Badriya and her husband, Aboud, producing a homemade remedy they
We have 3 sons. Each one of them was injured twice in the protests, and they refused to leave and go back home. My sons say they can't leave their brothers here and go back, so I decided to donate part of my pension so we could bring this water and yeast.
Day and night, they're here, mixing the ingredients, bottling, and distributing. Constant work left Badria's hand blistered, but she pushes on.
I'm not just coming out to support my sons, I'm here for everybody. This is my country, this is my Iraq, this is my land. All of these people are like my sons and my brothers and my fathers.
Mahawi says Badria and Aboud aided him after he was tear-gassed while protesting, but that their presence has helped him even more.
When we see these elderly people out here leaving their homes and their relatives staying out, how could I leave? How could I go home? There are people here that are 40, 50, 60 years old.
Despite the tension and fear surrounding the protests in Baghdad, these days in Tahrir Square, the mood is often vibrant in this unprecedented cross-generational demand for rights and reforms. The sense of community that's taken root here is remarkable, an atmosphere of family and familiarity that's hard to miss. Yes, these demonstrations have been led by the youth, but look just beyond the youngsters and you'll clearly see the multitudes of grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles who are standing behind these protesters, both figuratively and literally. The old backing the young, spurning politics, shunning sectarianism, and uniting as Iraqis. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
Lebanon's president says the economic situation is getting worse because of widespread protests. Anti-government rallies have ramped up since Michel Aoun urged demonstrators to end their revolt against the ruling elite. One man was shot dead on Tuesday south of Beirut. The army says a soldier has been detained after forces opened fire on the protesters, blocking roads around the capital. Several countries have urged Egypt to investigate alleged killings by its security forces and other rights abuses. The United Nations Human Rights Council is reviewing Egypt's record as part of a regular examination of all member states.
We recommend Egypt 1. Address impunity by credibly investigating allegations of extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced disappearances by security forces. Publicly release findings and prosecute those responsible. 2. Release detainees held for exercising their rights to freedom of expression or association and ensure fair trial guarantees for those remaining in detention. 3. Commit to supporting a free and active civil society by ending case number 173, foreign funding investigations, travel bans, and asset freezes against civil society.
And Egypt's health ministry says 6 people have been killed and 15 injured after an oil pipeline caught fire on Wednesday. The blaze broke out in Itay al-Barud. It's unclear when the pipeline was broken, but many locals had gathered to fill containers with leaking fuel before the fire began. The first ever case of Ebola has been reported in the southern African nation of Lesotho. It's in the town of Leribe. An outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo, which is much further north, has claimed more than 2,000 lives. And in just a few hours, health authorities in DRC will begin testing a new Ebola vaccine, but the rollout is already facing criticism. Catherine Soy reports from Goma in the DRC.
A new Ebola vaccine for a major trial. Scientists are testing it on up to 500,000 Congolese over the next 10 months to study its effects.
The vaccine is safe. It has already been tested on a small sample of people elsewhere. Our Ebola coordinator, Professor Muyembe, would not have approved it if it was harmful to the people.
But some people are concerned that the long-term effects of the drug made by a US multinational are not yet known, and the fact that it needs 2 doses 8 weeks apart may not work on people who travel often.
It's a challenge, and the restitution rate between the 2 doses will be an indication of the acceptance of this vaccine in the population. We will work with the communities who will explain to the communities. We believe that if we explain simply things to the people, they are able to understand.
About 250,000 people in parts of this region are already being injected with another vaccine made by a German company that has just been approved by European regulators. Those receiving the newer drug live in areas that are considered at low risk of an Ebola outbreak. This is a very busy border crossing between DR Congo and Rwanda. Tens of thousands of people, mostly traders, use it every day. Health workers say vaccinating them is crucial. Feelings here over both vaccinations are mixed.
This vaccine is good. It helps us go about our business without fear.
I can never do it. I don't know what they're injecting into us. They did it in Beni and people are still dying. Now Goma.
Ebola vaccinations in the Democratic Republic of Congo have long been controversial and political. One health minister is reported to have lost his job earlier this year for opposing the US study. Some Congolese say they don't trust what's going on, but health workers insist this is the best way of beating a disease that has killed many people. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Goma.
All right, time for a quick check of the headlines here this hour. The Palestinian armed group Islamic Jihad says a ceasefire has been agreed in Gaza after 2 days of cross-border fighting. Egypt has been mediating with the group and Israel. Negotiations were taking place as more missiles and rockets were exchanged in the early hours of Thursday. 32 Palestinians have been killed since Tuesday. The escalation began after a senior leader of Islamic Jihad was killed in an Israeli airstrike. The first public hearing in the impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump has ended. The U.S.'s acting ambassador in Ukraine said he was told that Trump cared more about an investigation into his rival Joe Biden than he did about Ukraine. Trump's alleged to have pressured Kiev into investigating Biden in exchange for military aid.
I found a confusing and unusual arrangement for making U.S. policy towards Ukraine. There appeared to be two channels of U.S. policy making and implementation, one regular and one highly irregular.
Well, Donald Trump was dismissive of what he's already called a witch hunt.
I hear it's a joke. I haven't watched for 1 minute because I've been with the president, which is much more important as far as I'm concerned. This is a sham and shouldn't be allowed. It was a situation that was caused by people that shouldn't have allowed it to happen. I want to find out who is the whistleblower. And because the whistleblower gave a lot of very incorrect information, including my call with the president of Ukraine, which was a perfect call.
Meanwhile, President Trump says the alliance with Turkey remains strong despite differences on important issues. He made those comments after holding talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Washington. Relations have been strained over policies on Syria and Turkey's purchase of a Russian missile defense system. Major transport routes in Hong Kong have been forced to close. Police are preparing for a fourth consecutive day of midweek demonstrations. Schools have been shut across the city. The US has formally recognized Bolivia's interim leader, but there's widespread opposition to the appointment of Jeanine Áñez. 2 protesters were killed on her first day in office. She took over after Evo Morales resigned on Sunday over his disputed re-election. Those were the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after the stream. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Talk to Al Jazeera. We ask. They don't believe in the two-state solution. Do you still believe in the two-state solution? We listen.
What I said was that Pakistan would never start a war. I'm anti-war.
We meet with global newsmakers and talk about the stories that matter on Al Jazeera.
Freedom or death. That was the rallying cry of the largest slave rebellion in the U.S. more than 200 years ago. This week, hundreds of people brought it back to life during a powerful reenactment. I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Join us on Twitter or in our live YouTube chat to talk about the lessons learned from the resistance. In 1811, some 500 slaves marched for 2 days in an effort to take over New Orleans and declare a free republic. Their attempt was reenacted this week by participants dressed in period costumes. Armed with weapons, they beat drums and chanted for their rights as they walked past the oil refineries and trailer parks that replaced the sugar plantations of the 19th century. The event was the brainchild of performance artist Dred Scott. He came up with an alternate ending to the march, a celebration instead of a massacre. He briefly spoke to the stream about how he hopes the reenactment will help empower people.
This was a project about freedom and emancipation.
B, that it is something that really celebrates an important point in American history. This 1811 revolt should be much more known, and the rebels were heroes. And I also want people to think about how this past connects to the present, not just the past of slavery, but actually the past of freedom fighters, people fighting to get free from oppression and exploitation. And what does that say for us today? How do people walk in the shoes of those rebels and come up with radical solutions to the problems we confront right now?
Joining us to discuss from New Orleans, Louisiana, Kaya Livers. She is the head of community outreach for the Slave Rebellion reenactment. Ibrahima Seck is director of research at the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. It's the only plantation museum in the region that focuses on slavery. And Andrew Rakich is a filmmaker for Atunche Films. He produced a documentary about the 1811 slave rebellion earlier this year. Welcome all of you to the stream. Now, you all attended the reenactment last week, some as participants, some as spectators, but I want to pick your brains on what it was like. But first, this from people online using the hashtag Slave Rebellion Reenactment to share pictures and videos of what that was like. This from Eric Johnson. Have a listen there. They're chanting on to New Orleans. We're going to end slavery, freedom, or death, and join us. Kaya, when did you learn about the 1811 rebellion?
Well, I discovered a paragraph in a book in the mid-90s that just the topic was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, and it turned out to be Louisiana. I was filled with so much pride at that moment. And then it took a couple of more years before anything was really published about the event. And by the end of the 90s, I had created a production with kids to tell the story.
Filled with pride because that's your hometown. And so you're saying this was not too long ago that you found out about it. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you didn't learn this history growing up?
Well, this history is suppressed. I mean, even today, up until this event, it was difficult to talk about. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Everyone wanted to keep it in the closet or suppressed because it's very painful to talk about slavery. But we have to have those conversations.
So I want to share here a map. Ibrahima, you shared this with our producers ahead of the show. New Orleans and the German coast, 1811. Talk to us about what we're seeing on this map and what it represents.
Yeah, on this map, this is from a book by one of the two authors who wrote about the rebellion. His name is Dan Rasmussen. And you see on the left, on the other side of the river, the Manuel Andres plantation. That's where the rebellion started. And then they moved downriver to capture New Orleans. And they were stopped. You see the last plantation for New Orleans where they stopped. That's for the 14th plantation. That's where the Bonnet-Carré Spillway is today. The Bonnet-Carré Spillway is some kind of infrastructure that allowed to take the overflow of the river into Lake Pontchartrain. But most of the fight happened also here on when you go back, they retreated upriver to Bernard Berrugui's plantation. And after they were defeated, most of them were taken to trial on the Jean-Noël Destréhan plantation. And that plantation is still standing.
And the interesting thing about the Kenner and Henderson plantation, Ibrahima, is as I'm sure you know, that's where the airport stands today. And that was where one of the initial skirmishes happened.
Absolutely.
When the American militia that was in the city tried to face off against these slave rebels. Now, at that time, of course, the slave rebels were about 500 strong, and the Americans could only scrape together 100 men from the city. So it was not very hopeful for the powers that be and for the plantation class. So next time, folks, when you're flying into the New Orleans airport, just keep in mind that this is where that first skirmish went down.
That is incredible. Andrew, what do we know about how this got started, how the plot to rebel formed?
Oh, man, it's an amazing story. I mean, Charles Deslandes, the leader of the rebellion, and this was all his kind of brainchild, right? He was as far as I'm concerned, like the William Wallace of the American South. And his story was just incredible. He was incredibly clever and incredibly resourceful. And yeah, he was a mixed race slave driver on the Woodland plantation owned by, as Ibrahima said, Manuel Andre, his master. And as such, he had special privileges. And he was seen by his fellow slaves as Manuel Andre's lapdog, essentially, his right-hand man. And he would ask his master, hey, master, can I go to the Trepanier estate to visit my girlfriend? And his master would say, oh, yeah, go ahead. It's fine. Spend the night. And Deslandes would spend the night going around to different plantations, stirring stuff up and trying to get these more rebels to his cause. And he did this for months.
Mm-hmm. I think it went on more than just months. I believe it went on for years, because we're talking about a time period where there's no social media, no telephone communications. In order for him to be able to move about during 2 different plantations, he had to really build up a respectable reputation with his master, his enslaver. So he was very smart, and one of the things I believe he did was maintain the stories that had been brought from the Haitian Revolution until
that definitely inspired him for sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that's something when the idea started.
Ibrahima, you were trying to say?
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution was an inspiration for them. But Charles Delon was born right there by the Manuel Andre plantation, and let's remember also the Maroons, who played a very important role in communication.
And Maroons, for those of our audience who's not familiar with that history, the Maroons are slaves or people who tried to run away from being enslaved or from slavery and went where?
Yeah, people who ran away from the plantation, and they went to hide into the swamp. And at night, they would move from plantation to plantation to look for food, to meet their people, and also to convey information. And you can see it in the archives of Louisiana, especially St. John the Baptist Parish, St. Charles Parish. There were so many Maroons out there in the woods, in the swamp, and Charles Delon was able to build up all of those people available. And let's not forget also, let's remember also the domestics. Maybe they had privileges, better food, better cloth, but that played a very important role in the dissemination of information coming from the big house, from the masters to the slave quarters.
So Kaya, I want to share another picture from people because they're so striking seeing these images here. Anasa Hicks tweet this. They hear #slave rebellion reenactment, and you can see just one picture, a depiction of what was going on last week. This took about 6 years, right? From idea to fruition. Why did it take so long? What was happening in that process?
Well, research was happening, but also funding. Funding was very important, and we started this project during the Obama years, and then we shifted into a Republican president, and Republicans are not friendly to the arts.
So how did you come over that hurdle? What happened? How did it happen?
Well, it happened because Dred Scott was persistent, and he was determined to have this project and have this event happen. So I don't know all of the details of what he did to raise funds, but I know he spent 5 years, even up until a month or 2 weeks before the event occurred. He was still talking to people who could possibly donate or provide some funding resource to us.
And I think it's something that is much appreciated by at least people that we're talking to, people in our community, and people who have spoken to us about what it meant to them. I want to play a video comment from one of those people. She's a writer and a historian. Her name is Allison Bing, and here's what she told the stream.
This is an important American work of art. Too often, U.S. history is explained as a series of conquests, of battles fought and land taken. This leads Americans to believe we have one choice: conquer or be conquered. That's a depressing prospect. But we also have a tradition of resistance against impossible odds. The German Coast Slave Uprising proves that. Dred Scott's reenactment reminds us that resistance is a hard-won inheritance. And it also might be the through line in American history.
Ibrahima, she mentions we have a history and a tradition of resistance against impossible odds. Do you think that that is something that people think of when they think of slavery? Do they think of the resistance?
Yeah. Oftentimes people don't think about resistance. Someone said maybe last year that 400 years of slavery for black people must have been a choice, but not knowing really what was going on during slavery time. People fought against slavery all the time. From the time they were brought over here from Africa, even starting in Africa, it was always about resisting, and you don't even know how many uprisings were plotted and that were not executed. You know, this is one of the few that came into execution. But slavery went all the way with resistance. People resisted from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, and this should be taught more. I mean, like the person in the clip said, what's more American than resisting against impossible odds? But this very highly American story, you know, you can make comparisons to the Revolutionary War and all of these American struggles for freedom, right, is, as Dred Scott said, virtually unknown. And I think largely that's because it just doesn't fit into the narrative of how we as Americans like to see ourselves. You know what I mean?
One of the reasons I took so much pride when I first saw the paragraph about Louisiana taking a stand was I know we have a very strong civil rights history, but to know that we had went as far back as 1811 and took a stand. And the thing about it was that they didn't just run away. They organized themselves. They organized to take over the government and to make a place for themselves in America, because they could have easily just ran away and lived in the swamps and the woods and just scattered. Most of them probably would have survived if they just would have done that, but they were making a major statement. And
they almost won too. They almost succeeded. It was really just through kind of bad luck and one or two sort of little circumstances. I mean, if Deslandes had been successful in killing Manuel Andry, his master, instead Andry escaped in the middle of the night, getting stabbed multiple times, and he saw his son killed in front of him, and he was bleeding, and he ran to a rickety canoe moored in the river by the levee, and he was able to row across the river, bleeding profusely, and finally got to a buddy's house on the west bank of the river, Charles Perret's house, and was able to raise that militia, which then 2 days later went back across the river and hit the slave army in the rear, which was what eventually kind of caused their downfall.
But Andrew, that is vivid and very clear and concise the way that you just put that across, and yet I've never heard that before. Growing up here in the U.S., in the education that I had, which I like to think was quite good, never heard that description, and actually don't even know if I learned about this rebellion. I know I'm not the only one, though, unfortunately, and I want to bring in a comment from someone watching on YouTube. Elizabeth Rainey, watching live, says, whoever controls the past controls the future. If we don't teach Black kids, or I would add in any kids, American kids, about these moments of resistance, they won't be inspired to fight for a better future. So her comment is juxtaposed with the comment of someone who was referenced a little bit earlier. Ibrahima, you referenced this. I want to play it for our audience. It talks about this myth. The myth that slaves were complicit and complacent in their captivity. It's persistent. Rapper Kanye West caused an uproar last year when he said something about it, and it was on the tabloid news website TMZ. It went viral. Have a look.
You hear about slavery for 400 years? For 400 years? That sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all?
So, Ibrahim, I'll give that one back to you. A choice.
I'm looking for Kanye West. I always ask people if they meet him, tell him I want to meet him at the Midnight Plantation so we can have a discussion.
An open invitation, Kanye.
Yeah, please. And we'll have a very, frank and...
What would you tell him? Because I know there's people in our audience, I'm sure, people who are watching who might think similarly.
I would tell him what I tell to visitors when they come to the Midnight Plantation, no matter the color of the skin or whatever. It is about understanding slavery and why it happened and why it lasted so long. It was a system very well organized and people fought against it. Personally, before I forget, I would like to compare what Charles Delon did and his followers.
Judah Production. We hope you enjoyed it.
We gotta get him.
We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you gave us a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Good night, Judah.